This is the Sony Fx30, an APS-C Super 35 sensor cinema-line Sony camera built for professional and unprofessional filmmaking on a budget. And if you want to know what everything I just said meant, then stick around. At first glance, this camera seemed to be an answered prayer, but is it really all that it's chalked up to be? Yes. In this video, I'm going through all of the interesting features of this camera that make it, in my opinion, the best option for both professional and unprofessional filmmaking on a budget. Let's get into it. Now, in the past, I'd always used Canon cameras. My first camera was the Canon M50 Mark II, and it served me really well. I had this camera for about 3 years, and I did a lot of really cool stuff with it. I started off not shooting great footage on it, however, eventually I used it enough and I got good enough with the settings and with how to use the camera when I was able to shoot really good shots that looked like this. This right here shows you that you don't need a $3,000 camera in order to shoot something beautiful. You can have a cheap $800 camera, and that can do just fine if you're a beginner. Now, the better you get, the more that smaller camera will start to limit your capabilities, which is why eventually I moved from this camera to the Canon EOS R5, my dad's photography camera. That's the camera I'm using to record right now because obviously the Sony Fx30 is right here, and that camera served me really well. It really was fantastic. However, it was my dad's photography camera, and while that meant it did have a viewfinder, which this camera does not, and I'll get into that later, it meant that he also faced the issue of it overheating, meaning if I used it outside and it got too hot, then the camera would overheat, and it meant I had to wait a little while before I could use it again. That was one limiting factor that I really did not like about that camera. So I did some research and I started saving up, and eventually I bought the Sony Fx30. The Fx30 is a cinema line camera, a little brother to the Sony Fx3, which is Netflix approved. However, the Fx30 is not Netflix approved. A blog posted by George Cezo states this: "It's marketed as a more affordable entry-level cinema camera designed for indie filmmakers, content creators, and aspiring cinematographers. It's a fantastic option for those looking to capture high-quality video at a lower price point, but it isn't necessarily built for the same heavy-duty productions as Netflix originals." The full article is linked in the description, but it basically says, hey, it's not Netflix approved, however, it does work pretty freaking well for its price point, and I definitely agree. The main difference between this and the Fx3 is that this camera has an APS-C Super 35 sensor. This means many things, one of which is it's a cheaper camera with less expensive and lighter lenses. Here's what I mean by that. This right here is the lens that I bought with the camera. It's a Tamron 17-70. Now this lens was about $700, however, it is an APS-C size lens to go with this camera. If I bought another lens, also 17-70mm, but for a full frame camera, not only would the lens be a lot bigger, however, it would have been a lot more expensive as well. But because I bought a lens to fit this camera, the camera was cheaper and the lens was also a lot cheaper as well. Here's what else an APS-C sensor means. Any footage you shoot on an APS-C size sensor camera will be cropped. So for instance, if I take my Fx30 and I attach the lens that I have to it, if I'm on a 17mm lens, instead of the field of view looking like it's 17mm, it will actually be zoomed in by 1.5, meaning a 17mm will actually be about a 25mm, because you multiply 17 by the 1.5 times crops. It also has a 1.6 times crops if you're shooting 4K and 120 frames per second, or it has a 1.6 times crops if you're shooting in 1080p at 240 frames per second. However, the 1.5 times crop factor of an APS-C size sensor does not decrease the camera resolution or the camera quality. The crop factor simply refers to the field of view when comparing it to a full frame sensor. Basically, it does not mean you're losing quality as if you were to zoom in and post. Okay, so now that all of that's out of the way, next I'm going to cover everything about the camera body regarding its performance. So the first thing that I want to talk about this camera is that it does not have a viewfinder. The little thing right here that you can see through, it doesn't have that. Now the reason for that is because this is a cinema camera and not a photography camera, you wouldn't really need one. I use this camera for photography as well, so I don't really love that decision because number one, for photography, it's really good to be able to see through it. However, also when I'm filmmaking, I always find myself looking through here to get a clean image because sometimes the sunlight bounces off the screen and you can't see it as well. So when you look through the viewfinder, it looks like a much cleaner image, but this camera doesn't have that. However, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Number one, you can get used to it. Number two, eventually when I buy an external monitor for this camera, it means I wouldn't really use a viewfinder anyway, so eventually I will outgrow it. However, currently, I do sometimes wish that it has one, even though it would just take up space, and it probably would have made this camera a little bit more heavy as well. Now, as I just said, I use this camera for photography as well. I've gotten into portraits, and this camera is excellent for that. I'll talk about this later, but it has a 26 megapixel sensor, which is really good for photography. It also has an electrical shutter and not a mechanical shutter, so when you take pictures, it's quiet as opposed to it making that clicking sound. Another thing about this camera is it has a cooling fan inside of it, meaning there is no overheating. Like I mentioned before with my dad's camera, when I film stuff outside, I often face the issue of it overheating. Because of the fan in here and the options you get in setting where you can customize how the fan works, it means I've never had an issue of this camera overheating, even when I've had it running for an extended period of time. Another beautiful thing I love about this camera is the fact that it has programmable buttons. It has programmable buttons. There are 3 buttons on top labeled IRS, white balance, and ISO, and I kept the white balance one where it changes with your white balance, and I made the ISO one where you click it, it switches between the 2 base ISOs of 800 and 2500. Another thing I did is I made this little joystick button right here where if you click it in the center, then it switches between manual and autofocus mode. That way I can effortlessly switch between manual focus and autofocus while I'm shooting, because sometimes you really have to switch between the two kind of quickly. Everything else I kind of kept the same because the buttons all make sense what they are. However, all of them can be programmed in whichever way you want to, so just know that is an option if you want it. Another great thing about this camera body is that it has 1/4-20 mounting holes all over the place. Some on the top, some on the sides, and one on the bottom. This is so that you can easily attach it to a camera rig. The last note about this camera body is that it has multiple card slots. 2 of them are normal SD card slots, and then 2 of them are CF card slots, which are really helpful if you have cards that fit those. You can also choose to record to both of the cards at the same time, or to just one and then have it fill over to the other one. It's good to know that those options are there even if you don't exactly plan on using them. Hey guys, so editing Jesse here, and there's one thing that I forgot to talk about this camera that is absolutely something that I think everybody needs to know, and that is the fact that this camera has multiple recording buttons. There's one button on the top that is record, and you can also make the shutter button also record as well. However, there's one button in the front of the camera that is automatically set to record. Now I think that's really cool because let's say for a vlog type video, instead of me reaching back behind the camera, I can just reach up and then click that one right there. It's a really simple design, but I think it's really intuitive, and I'm definitely glad that they added it. And I definitely think that it's something that everybody needs to know if you're getting ready to buy this camera. Okay, now let's get back to whatever I'm about to talk about. But first, subscribe. Perfect. Okay, so now on to the crazy specs of this camera. It has a 26 megapixel sensor camera, and it shoots 6K downsampled to 4K, which means that the 4K that you shoot with this camera is actually going to be sharper than if you shoot normal 4K, because it's taking more pixels and it's compressing them into a smaller space. Next up is the outdoor quality of this camera. I was completely blown away by it. A little while ago, I went to my grandparents' house, and I shot a lot down there. I actually made a video compiling a lot of the footage I shot down there, plus some other outside footage I shot. So if you want a short little video of what this camera is capable of in terms of its outdoor performance, I would go ahead and watch that video right now because it was shot beautifully, and I think that'll really show you exactly what it's capable of. One thing to note though is that lighting is actually more important than your camera specs, so if you have an incredible camera but it's not shot in great lighting at all, then that's not going to look good. But if you have a less expensive camera with a less good lens like this M50 Mark II, however you light it really well, then you could get really good shots. Here's an example of something I shot with the M50 Mark II, and here's an example of something that I shot with the FX30. And while this quality is better, this is still really impressive, and that's because of the lighting. You have to work for that, and also watch lots of lighting videos by Jesse Starling to improve yourself as well. Now, when talking about the low light capability, it's really up to your own judgment. However, I don't think it's that bad at all. I wanted a camera that can shoot pretty good in low light, and I'm definitely glad that I got this camera. While yes, it could be better, it's also not marketed as a low light camera. However, it can provide really good low light shots. One important thing to note though is that any camera you get at a consumer budget is not going to perform as good as, let's say, a Red camera. Those cameras are built for cinema and they're built for low light. However, it can't do everything as good as an $80,000 camera. Next up is this camera has the option to shoot with Cine EI and has a base ISO of 800 and 2500. Now, Cine EI can get kind of complicated, and there are tons of videos on YouTube about how that works, so if you're really confused, then you can watch some of those videos after this one. However, I'm going to explain what it is first. If you go into your camera and select the Cine EI button, it'll basically give you the option to shoot in either 800 ISO or 2500 ISO. Now, let's say you're sitting on the base ISO of 800. If you look right here, it says 800 EI on your camera. That means that you're currently shooting 800 ISO and your display screen is showing what the footage will look like at 800 ISO. They match. Now, let's say you take the exact same base ISO of 800, except now you take the EI setting and you lower it down to, let's say, 500. Now, you're still on 800 ISO. However, the camera display screen is showing you what this would look like if you actually shot it on 500 ISO instead of 800 ISO. The reason for that is because it's better to shoot overexposed and then edit your footage down. And this will show you if I'm shooting at 800 ISO, what it's going to look like when I edit it down to 500 ISO. And then if you switch to the base ISO of 2500, this will cap your ISO, where now it won't let you go beyond 2500 because then you would notice a lot more grain in your footage, so that stops you from doing that. However, if you want to shoot at 2500 ISO, you can take the EI setting and move it past 2500, so that will then show you what that image will look like. That is a really simple explanation of what a complex setting is, so if you're still confused, there are lots of videos on YouTube about what that setting does, and I can also make one too if you guys are curious. However, that gets the point across. One other camera spec that I want to cover before I move on is that this camera shoots 10-bit 422 color, which basically means that you have more information when you're color grading than if you were to shoot in 8-bit. Basically, the more bits the better. However, it can also mean that when you're editing, it can slow your computer down a lot because it's dealing with a lot more information, rather than if you're dealing with less information, your computer may be able to handle that easier. I know that for me, when I'm editing, sometimes it is really laggy, and it takes me forever to edit even a simple scene where it really shouldn't take that long. It just takes forever for the computer to load what I'm doing. Alrighty, so before we get into the conclusion of whether or not this is a good camera to buy, there are still a couple other things I need to cover that don't really fit into a certain category. First of all, the GUI is really simple for this camera. After playing with it for just a little bit, I really got a good understanding of where everything was in this camera. I think it was really well designed. Also, there is an optional XLR audio handle for this camera that you can buy with it. It costs a couple $100, and you definitely don't have to buy this. However, that is there to capture really good audio directly on the microphone. This also has top-notch Sony autofocus, which tracks really well and has really good face detection as well. The image stabilization is also really good on this camera. However, there is an additional crop when you turn active stabilization on. Here's one fix that I found to that. There is an option called Sony Catalyst, not only where you can color grade your footage in Catalyst, however, there's also an option to where you can stabilize the footage in Catalyst. It uses the camera's gyro data to stabilize your footage a lot better than if you used warp stabilizer in Premiere Pro. That kind of warps your footage a little bit, whereas Catalyst doesn't warp it at all. It just crops it a little bit and stabilizes it. Next up is the battery life. It honestly is really impressive. I just did a Buffalo Spicy Hot Wing challenge, and we recorded non-stop on this camera for about 45 minutes, and the battery only got to about 60%. I brought a secondary battery just in case, but we didn't even have to use it, so that was really cool. You can also use this camera as a webcam by plugging your camera directly into your computer. However, just make sure you get a wide enough lens where the 1.5 times crops won't really affect your footage. Last but not least, the price. This camera is marketed as a cinema line camera, and that comes with many expectations. Fortunately for us, it meets them. I do wish that the low light footage was a little bit less grainy at times. However, I wouldn't let that one thing be a deciding factor that stops you from getting this camera, seeing as it still performs fairly well in low light situations. Overall, I am really impressed with this camera, and I absolutely have zero regrets even 4 months after buying this camera. If you're looking for a budget-friendly cinema camera, whether it's for your YouTube videos or for your short films or whatever it is, this camera is absolutely a good option. If you like this video and you want to help support me and make me really happy, is subscribing by clicking this button right here. That will mean the world to me, and you can also watch this video right here. If you like this video, then I really think you'll like this one, so watch that one too. And I will see you guys later. Have a great rest of your day.